Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
Great, thanks.
Awesome. Well, so we were just talking right before about when I was going to the CASH convention, which is the California Speech and Hearing Association convention for California SLPs. But I was just starting to meet people that were so interested in using music to do speech and therapy, speech and language therapy. So, um,
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
yeah,
I mean,
so awesome.
I just hope that that there will be a day when music will just be a part of what a speech language therapy pathologist does. You
Yeah,
know, even if you don't do the therapy yourself, but that you're connected with the School of Music or you're connected with local musicians or whatever it is, but that it's understood that part of speech therapy is also making some music.
absolutely. And I love pushing therapists to do that because I feel like there's this misconception that, oh, I can't sing or I can't hold a pitch and I'm bad at music. That means, I shouldn't do this in front of my kids. But I've just seen it be so powerful when therapists open up and they try something that might make them vulnerable to the kids that they're working with. It's such a nice
Yeah.
reframe.
But I mean, in the various circles that I work in, I frequently encounter people who are concerned about doing music, making music because they're not good enough. And we
Yeah.
have to, that's another thing. There are a couple of misconceptions that we have to reconceive, right? We have to bust some myths. One is that music is not just for the people who are good and talented and famous, but music is for everyone. It is a way of life. Similarly, music is and should be part of speech language therapy and part of at least what a speech language therapist considers as part of the therapeutic process. And again, it's not a matter of being um, you know, Juilliard trained musician. You just you just make the music that's natural to make. And with kids, everybody can sing songs,
Yeah.
clap your hands, clap your feet, and you get all this therapy done, and the therapist and the kids have a good time.
I'm thinking one of my SLPAs has just started working in a new school district, and she went into the classroom and watched this SLP do therapy, all day, and it was like 90% flashcards, and the kids, none of them wanted to be there, and it's like how much more, and we've talked about this before, but what you pay attention to, what you care about, is what you learn, and so just from that perspective, doing music making it fun again, making it, exciting and engaging for kids. Just that in itself is gonna, increase learning, make them want to come back and build rapport and all these other things that are just important human things to have.
And to teach language through music, also, explicitly in terms of songs and nursery rhymes, and that's all languages. That's music and language together.
Yeah.
Powerful too.
And that's the one of the chapters we're going over today. We're covering a lot of ground today, but chapters 8 through 10. So the first one's music and language, a partnership. And I think we have touched on music a bunch already. So, we can just maybe touch on a few different things. But I'm wondering, you talk about there's these two really cool projects that you did. One is the Harmony Project, and also working with the music director in Chicago schools. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about those. And I think this is really cool research to illuminate, how powerful music can be for
Yeah,
education broadly.
yeah, absolutely. So, here I am sitting in my lab and being a scientist, and who should come up but two founders of music programs in different parts of the country. One is in Chicago Public Schools, and the other was in LA. And they were both in, one was in the gang reduction zones of LA, and the other was in an area serving many underserved kids, high schools where they were not in the most resourced part of town, but these were the founders of music programs that served these populations in a number of different schools in those two areas. And they came to me and they said, you know, Nina, the teachers, we at our different schools, we already know that the kids who make music are the better students. They're the better readers. They're just the better students. They're doing well academically. So we know that already. Music is very good for learning, but they wanted to know what is going on in their brains. And so they had thrown down the gauntlet, and we just took it up, and I have this wonderful team of people that I work with at Brain Volts, and in particular, Jen Krisman was a big leader and continues to lead all kinds of things at Brain Volts, both of our Chicago-based and our LA projects. And so we would go to these places, and we would measure the kids' brain responses to sound. We would administer standardized measures of learning and academic achievement, of which speech pathologists are, I think, very well familiar with, measures of auditory and visual attention and things like that. And then, these kids, we followed the kids longitudinally for 4 years in both locations. So the Chicago group was high school kids, and the LA kids was elementary school kids. And so we followed these two groups for years, 4 years. And believe me, the long and longitudinal studies is no joke, because we had to go there year after year, and
Yeah, wow.
and collect the data ahead of time. These are all kids who wanted to be in these programs, but we divided them into either kids who underwent music training, or we had another group of kids who underwent a kind of athletic training, so
Hmm.
that everybody got enrichment, but it was a different kind. And so we had good control groups, and we had matched them at the beginning. They were equivalent in their reading scores and in their ability to listen in noise and in their brain responses to sound. So they were equivalent at the beginning, and then we followed them for 4 years. After 1 year, there were some differences in language skills. So already the kids who were making music were doing better in the language measures, the pre-reading and reading scores. But we didn't see any changes in the brain's response to sound over a 1 year period. And so we could have given up. But it was really Jen who says, "Well, so we got to keep going." And so as I said, we did this for 4 years in the end. But after 2 years, in both cohorts, both in the high schoolers and in the kids who were in elementary school, after the second year, we saw very objective changes in how the brain responds to sound. So here, we were using the frequency following response, which,
Hmm.
as you know, is a response that is just obtained with a handful of electrodes on the head. And we measured the response to speech sounds. And we could see that, as I said, after 1 year, there was no difference either in any group, no change. But after 2 years, we saw uh, what we have seen in other studies. We saw the musician signature emerge, which is heightened representation of the harmonics in sound and heightened representation of timing, which of course is important not only for music, but it's tremendously important for speech, because the
Right.
differences between one phoneme and another phoneme are really in the harmonics and timing cues, in FM sweeps, changes in frequency over time that happen very quickly. And so these are the kinds of, well, you speech pathologists, these are the formants and the formant transitions. And so after, at year two, what we saw was that the kids who were making music had more robust and more accurate responses to sound, faster timing and larger representation of the harmonics and phase. And then this was accompanied by behavioral changes in reading. So, in underserved populations, what typically happens is, what is known as the achievement gap, where you can have, kids that start out, say, in reading scores, fairly equivalent, maybe in kindergarten or first grade pre-reading. And then as the years go on, um, kids from disadvantaged neighborhoods, um, their scores in reading kind of get worse,
Mm.
whereas, kids who are given more resources and these resources can come in the form of enrichment with music and with reading. And then you see that the gap widens between the rich and poor,
Mm.
and making the music, instead of widening that gap, made it smaller, so
Yeah.
that the kids who made music, in fact, kept up with the more resourced peers and had better reading scores than the kids who did not engage in making music. So we saw in reading, and we also saw it in kids' ability to hear speech and noise. So, of course, being able to communicate is your ability to make sense of sound, especially in noisy environments like a classroom or a playground.
Mm.
And so, we gave the kids standardized measures where they had to repeat back sentences that occurred in noise. And what we saw is that the kids who made music, their ability to hear in noise was stronger, and their brain responses to speech and noise were stronger.
Mm.
So we had both biological evidence, and we were finally able, after 2 years, to say to these wonderful founders of music programs, they were Kate Hewlett, now Kate Johnson, and Margaret Martin at the two schools respectively. And they had, come to us, and we could finally tell them, look, not only are the kids doing better academically, but we can see biological changes in their brain. And the other thing that we see in kids who are underserved and who are living in poverty are brains that are excessively noisy. So,
Mm.
there's a lot of electricity in the brain. Obviously, the whole brain and body is fueled by electric events, electricity. And electrical noise is when the electricity is staticky, it's not synchronized. And
Right.
so there's a lot of electrical noise in the brains of these kids. And again, it really would appear that making music is one of the best ways to offset the deleterious effects of poverty, which often is accompanied by kids who aren't read to very much
Mm.
and aren't stimulated as
Right.
much. And the music really provides this stimulation, which changes their brain
That
and
is
their
so cool.
ability
Yeah.
to communicate through sound. I mean, what more do you want? And these have been published in the world's best journals. We have many publications in this line of work, both from our adolescents and our school age kids. And if you visit our website, or even in the book, you will see many references to this kind of work where we've done the science.
That's amazing. Yeah, we'll definitely link to those places for people to see. Yeah, and so I was working in an underserved district for 6 years as a SLP, and one thing I was thinking about when you mentioned that, one of the big changes that you see is the ability to hear noise. And at first I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. But as I thought more about it, I was thinking about how really critical that is, especially in today's environments. Because what I saw, when I went into a classroom, super noisy classrooms. Like, it's no longer a quiet situation where like no one's talking and then the teachers saying stuff. It's like almost perpetually noisy. And in a lot of those situations, I would be working with kids, and I could tell when they were not understanding something, but would just say, yeah, they would get embarrassed. They didn't want to say that they didn't understand something. I mean, that's like most kids. They're like, no, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. They'll like read, intention of the teacher or something on the face and just kind of pretend that they understand. And that, is kind of like Matthew's effects, right? Those build over time where, at some point you reach this point where like, I really missed, this huge block of information. I can no longer keep up with just pretending. And so I saw that again and again. And I was just thinking back to, oh man, a lot of the ability to hear noise is so fundamental for those reasons, and especially in today's environments. Yeah, for people listening, SLPs especially, like this is very hopeful. And this also kind of connects to the next chapter because both music and then in chapter 9, the bilingual brain are two ways in which you can offset certain brain challenges. Like you mentioned, the noisy brain, the ability to hear speech and noise. These things are offset by learning another language and also by music. These things that we have a bit of agency over.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they are offset. They are offset biologically. What's so nice is just to be able to see, we have the musician signature, which is heightened, the FM sweeps, the timing, the harmonics, and the bilingual brain. So a person who speaks multiple languages will have heightened representation, heightened encoding of the fundamental frequency, which
Mm.
carries the pitch of the voice, which of course, if you're communicating in multiple languages, you often identify a speaker or a speaker speaking another language by the pitch in their voice. And so, this is practice. We are what we do. So if we work on stimulating the hearing brain by challenging ourselves and having the fun of speaking multiple languages and making music, this has profound effects on how then your brain learns to respond to sound in ideal listening environments and in challenging listening environments, learning to pull out the signal from the noise. And after a while, when you do something as a musician or as a speaker of another language, you do things again and again and again, and eventually your brain becomes rewired so that when we measure these responses, when we measure FFRs, the kids can be asleep. They can be
Yeah.
asleep, they can be watching
Amazing.
a movie. It doesn't matter, but their brains have become heightened because they are now sound experts.
I'm so glad you did this too with high schoolers to show this because it's sort of like this misconception that we can't after a certain point, right? Your brain doesn't change very drastically, but you're saying no, even after just 2 years, which I mean in the scheme of things is like it's nothing really of consistent practice, you can have a like a brain change that's so drastic that you could see it when you're sleeping, which is just so cool to me in a high schooler. So
And you
yeah.
don't have to stop in high school.
Right.
I mean, we and
Right.
others have done studies in older adults, again, finding that making music will strengthen the hearing brain such that, as an older person, it's never too late. And, we know this from animal studies. We know that the nervous system continues to change. We continue to learn through sound until we die.
Yeah.
And again, music is one of the very best ways to learn through sound. And so it doesn't matter how old or how young you are, this is a good thing. And so, to you audiologists out there, you have somebody with a hearing loss, what you want to do is to encourage people to make music, even though you have a hearing loss. You say, here's your hearing aid, here is your music teacher.
I love that. I was hanging out with a friend, a musician friend of mine, actually in Japan not too long ago. And he was like, "Oh yeah, I was thinking about starting to learn Japanese." He was there for like a month or something, and then he's like, "But then I saw that AI is just going to start like being able to auto translate stuff for me. So there's no point in me doing that." And to me, it's like that's almost totally missing the whole point of in that, well, not the whole point in that, yes, it is helpful and but it's about how your brain changes and the growth that you experience and the fun that it is in like going through the process of learning a new language, or even in music, it's like it's not really the point to like end up, putting out songs or something. It's that process in itself is, it's just a beautiful part of life. It's like you mentioned this somewhere in the book, that this is like human education. And I think both music education and foreign, like, second language study, they're just considered like these, like, oh, that's extracurricular, that's extra stuff. But I think you make this really important point that, and Ian makes this point too in his book, it's something about beauty. It's that, like, beauty is not really this extra thing. It's this fundamental part of life that is, I don't know, very human. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that we strive for. I fully agree. I think that beauty it's ineffable in many ways, and people have different sense of beauty, but beauty is something that makes you feel good, and that is something that is very healthy to appreciate and to be a part of and to create. And it's really part of being alive if you can, create and experience beauty.
Yeah.
It is at the bottom of, in the end, people want to feel fulfilled. They want to feel good and as though they are part of the world and beauty. And this is why, I mean, I was so fortunate that I was brought up with, really appreciating the wonder of the natural world. I spent a lot of time as a child in the mountains,
Hmm.
and at the sea, in nature. And this is something that um, is, it makes me happy. It makes me communicate better. It makes me think better when, I really try to spend a lot of time, as much as I can, in nature. And I think many artists of all kinds, find that they are inspired um, by the beauty that we can find in the natural world. Um,
Absolutely. You made this really awesome point, and this connects a little bit to the next chapter after, music and bilingualism, but it's bird song. And you mentioned that when we hear birds, it's this deep signal to us because, like, back in our evolutionary past, we would, bird song would be a signal that, this is a good place to live, it's maybe it has abundant resources, something like that. So it's like this very deep rooted feeling of calm. And I certainly feel that when I hear, a nice auditory scene of a bunch of birds singing and
and
animal
there's
calls.
good evidence that the birds are singing not only for for territory and for mating, but when those needs are met, they sing. And I think, I can only imagine that they sing because it feels good, because they are enjoying the beauty.
That's so cool. Yeah, it reminded me of one of the chapters in Matter with Things, in Ian's book, and he was talking about values and values being this intrinsic part of the cosmos. And he mentioned Darwin and how Darwin, in one of his books, it was like the word beauty was like on every other page. And, he said that, like, um, you know, people often talk about beauty in terms of mate selection, and certainly, like, given beauty, it helps with mate selection. But he was saying, but it doesn't explain why we have this sense in the first place, really. Why do certain colors and tastes and smells and, and for us, sounds, why are they beautiful? And, it's something that's just kind of mysterious and, you know, cool to think about, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's mysterious and true. And if read, you know, countless literature and philosophy, and beauty um, is a value, and it's a value that exists in the world.
And it's funny, like, and I'm saying this as someone who loves science, but it's like science is always like, oh, can't measure it, like doesn't exist, and that means that, these things, these important things like music music education are just, considered unimportant things, extracurricular things.
I really think that the mark of a good scientist is someone who is open to art, open to the many things, to the limitations of science, to the many things that we cannot measure,
Hmm.
some that we, just haven't gotten there in terms of being able to measure, and some that are not measurable, that
Hmm.
we will never measure. And we need to feel comfortable with that and measure the things that we can and realize that there are so many biological processes and so many aspects of human behavior that are just not measurable. I keep bringing up the example of wisdom.
Hmm.
How do you measure wisdom? And yet, it's a value. It's a phenomenon that occurs, really due to experience over time,
Yeah.
and how that experience over time can be so helpful to the generations that are coming up.
Wisdom is so undervalued in society today, I think, and we need it more than ever now that we're, entering territory in which, like, we have no prior experience to really, think about these issues with AI and machines and how we should live a life. And so, yeah,
And I encourage anyone listening. I mean, obviously, you all know that both Garrett and I are admirers of Ian McGilchrist, but he spends a lot of time in his various publications and in his lectures really talking about the fact that a a brain works nothing like a machine. And machines are one thing, and a brain is something that is really completely different. And not only is the analogy wrong, but it is misguided, and it's something that we really have to watch out for. Um, and of course, he does this very eloquently and with great, enormous detail. Um, so I invite people to really embody that view, because it's as true as anything that I know.
that's beautiful. I love that you had your class talk about this too, because I think, like, wisdom is so important, and it's also important to hear the, uh, all the many insights that come from someone who's seeing it from a different perspective, someone younger, and or just anyone, understanding their viewpoint. So it's very cool, and we'll definitely link again to the book. I totally agree that it's such I think it's an important text for our time, as is
It's a
this book.
yeah, it is a text for our time, and it is, I think in our time we really especially in the West, we do a very, very bad job um, of honoring wisdom. And if you study aging and you study the things that can be measured, things like reaction time, and how many things can you remember, as you get older, some of these things um, get worse. But the things that you can't measure, the wisdom, the values, the ability to size up a situation and make a good decision, these are things that um, scientists are not very good at measuring, and yet we just can't forget about them.
Yeah.
And we have to take that information together with our science to try to understand the world as best we can.
Yeah, such an important point. Like, it's just the right hemisphere also needs to use the left hemisphere for, it's very important for a lot of things in the same way. It's like science has done so much for, science and technology have, like, made our lives, drastically better in so many ways. We need to use that in tandem with the wisdom that can guide us in the right direction. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well put.
Yeah. So with these, the birds, getting back to a little bit of bird song, because also just the fact that you brought this into the book, I think is so cool. Another way that you kind of have combined art and science and anthropology, and, like, I just thought it was a really cool addition. And there are certain things that were interesting parallels to language learning, like learning that songbirds are vocal imitators, for example. But I'm wondering, what do you think birdsong tells us about the sound mind? What was your kind of reason for adding this into the book?
Well, I really do think that there is sound there's so much sound in nature. And, I think that, I finally remembered the word hubris. We have
Yeah.
everything that is so human centric. But, birds are able to, and so many other animals and living creatures are able to use sound and vibration. And I think it's important not to just limit a book on sound to the human centric perspective,
Mm.
because it's vast. And this is something that I'm pursuing now in this next book that I'm in the middle of writing, but really to have this um, more dilated view, if you will, of sound and music. So it was very natural for me to bring birdsong in, and also as an example, just to wow us. If you and I play this for there's no, often nothing like communicating about sound through sound, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this podcast series. But one of the things that I play for my students is various bird songs slowed down.
Mm.
And if you slow down, what we might just hear as a little chirp, if you slow it down, suddenly, if you think of all the ingredients of sound, holy smokes, there are so many details that the bird is able to not only produce, but to process. And it's a
Yeah.
tremendous sophistication that I think we can learn about and learn from.
Yeah, one of my friends, he's a beatboxer, Ben Mirren, and he ended up doing field work with birds and like taking these, bird song and trying to turn them into beatbox sounds and stuff like that, and making music out of them. Um, and I guess that's, part of just one reason that it's just beautiful, and it's just like really amazing to dig into, these sounds that are so much different than ours. And I think, yeah, we can get stuck in this like, human centric view of, our, the sounds that we can hear are like, we can, well, because we have experience with them and understand that they're important, we process them in this special way. But then when we hear bird song, I think for people, most lay people, they hear it and it's like, okay, bird, it's like all put in this one box. But right when you slow it down, you hear all the intricate patterns. It like opens up this new world of possibility. And I thought it was really cool too how I was thinking about speech therapy, and I saw all these connections. So, you mentioned that the songbirds that are vocal imitators and they have tutors. I think it's usually the dad, right? That's the male songbird is the one that's singing. So, but the tutor will actually, he'll repeat certain patterns. He's not just singing and then, the younger songbird is like trying to learn. It's like there's this relationship there, and the tutor will actually repeat certain things. They'll slow it down. I just thought that was so incredible that that's happening. Yeah, the bird is needing to learn these things actively. And then, also that, the songbirds raised in isolation don't learn their species specific song. And so I think there's a misconception for, not all therapists, but some, and then, some parents as well, where it's like, they think that language just is supposed to come out like it's just growing like teeth or hair or something. And so they're like, why isn't my kid talking? What's wrong here? And it's like, there could be many biological things going on, but one important factor is teaching the language and like giving the imitative model and having language input. And like you're mentioning, this signature of poverty mostly comes out of the lack of being read to, the lack of hearing a lot of input, having those rich interactions where you're hearing language. And so I think this is an important reminder that even in songbirds, we need to be good models of language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And that reciprocity is very important. And that reciprocity is important for learning. And we, we know even in terms of language learning in humans that, kids will not learn as at all as well if they're taught sounds of other languages through through a mirror or through a screen or through but that you really need this in the moment in the same place back and forth, the reciprocity that sound connects us,
yeah,
and it connects us in part because of the back and forth,
yeah,
and no one knows better than a speech pathologist who really, the therapy session itself is such an important opportunity and such an important time to develop and to build these language skills that are built on imitation and rhyming and reciprocity and
yeah.
interaction.
Yeah. I'm just thinking now of like there's this really deep connection too, because you're mentioning how, that, when you're going through a device, it's you're missing out on some the sound in some ways is reduced quality, so you're probably missing out on some harmonic aspects of the sound. There's this lack of especially with delay and things like that, it's hard to really show that there's a change being affected in the environment when they say something or you say something, that sort of interaction is less rich. And so a lot of that was going on in the homes. Homes were becoming more noisy, and we saw this huge uptick in communication disorders through the pandemic. And there's an analog to that because you talk about birds during the COVID pandemic, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit because there's something interesting happening there.
Yeah, scientists uh, take opportunities when they arise, even if they are inopportune um, events. So uh, people noticed during the pandemic. A lot of people remarked, "Oh, I can really hear the birds." And so, at first people assumed, well, of course you can hear the birds better because there's not as much cacophony, there's not as much noise in the world. But the scientists who actually measured the bird calls and the birds singing found that the birds were actually singing more quietly than they had before the pandemic. So they were singing with less volume, and they also had songs that now, because they weren't just screaming to be heard above the din, there was more nuance in their song. So they were singing more quietly and more delicately and more flexibly and more nuanced. It's like when you have a piano that is not um, working especially well in terms of being able to be heard in a room, and you kind of bang on it, you lose a lot of the nuance,
Yeah,
both in the production and in what you actually create in the sound, and it was kind of amazing. I mean, people already before had found that the birds adjust their singing quality and patterns based on human traffic patterns and things like that. But the pandemic really, and there, I referenced it in the book, but there was an article that was published in Science. It was very carefully controlled study finding that in fact during the pandemic the birds, even though they sounded louder to us, were singing more softly.
yeah, it's so cool that yeah, there's this like increase in volume in the homes since everyone was like kind of inside, and so we had decreased like on in the human way we were like kind of decreased communication capacity, like the nuances of our communication sort of decreased, especially in infants that were learning to talk, and then on the outside when because our human noise was reduced, like the birds were you know singing with more intricacy. Yeah, it's really cool, and also shows how context dependent we are, how environment matters. And you talk a lot about this later, and we'll get to it. But how our sonic environment and the noise that's around is really affecting us in ways that we don't think about usually. Yeah. And you also mentioned that birds they go through a babbling phase. I was wondering what you think about the both the bird babbling and then the fact that it becomes crystallized. It's not as plastic as with human speech. But is there a deep analogy there between bird
Well,
babbling and human babbling?
I think that studying birdsong is fascinating for many, many reasons. One of the reasons is because when you listen to these bird songs, they're beautiful. But there are many parallels in language learning that we've talked about in terms of imitation and practice, so the practice again and again. And different species have nuances that they learn. And as I say, yes, scientists have observed that once the bird learns a song, he will kind of stay with that song, and it's been criticized perhaps as not being as flexible as human speech, which it may not be. But that said, also just in slowing down these songs, the bird songs, there is so much richness and flexibility and nuance that we as humans are deaf to. And so it could very well be that once um, the bird learns the song, they are able to put in all kinds of nuances that are meaningful to the birds.
Mm,
And but I think that the parallels are interesting. That there are certain things that are similar in different species as we learn to vocalize and we learn to communicate. And it's interesting also, I think, the birds give you this example of how the singing has a biological and a hormonal basis. It really is the male birds who, for the most part, sing, although female birds do sing, and as well. But in general, it is the male that does a lot of the singing, and but the female has to choose. The female chooses. So her auditory system has to be incredibly nuanced because there's a lot at stake here. If it's a matter of mating, it's important for the female to really to be astute sonically and to make the right choice, because a bird that is going to sing with vigor, enthusiasm, robustness, and nuance is probably something that the female bird recognizes as biologically healthier.
mm,
And but the auditory system has to be uh, tremendously tuned to be able to pick up on those nuances. And so it's really quite interesting. And interesting also how, you can take female birds and, give them a lot of testosterone, and they will sing.
mm.
So
Interesting.
there clearly is a hormonal basis, which we see certainly in the brain's response to sound in humans as well. We see in 3-year-olds that certain aspects of sound processing are identical, and then
Mm,
during adolescence, there are some differences just between male and female processing of sound.
mm,
Uh, and we have a whole series of articles, as others have shown as well. But the response to sound really differs if you're male or female with respect to its sensibility and sensitivity.
mm.
Uh,
Also
and
interesting.
and so this is a biological system. Like, when why birds, birds are we can study these animals, and to be able to understand more about hormonal bases of sound making. We can we've learned a lot from um, the different studies that you may have heard of a guy at Rockefeller Institute, Nottebohm, who did a lot of the Nottebaum. He has done the pioneering work on birdsong, decades ago already, and really just kind of stunning us by
Mm.
how big and beautiful the bird song world is. And there are, this is something that is pervasive in other species, that there are male and female differences in terms of sound production and sound reception.
It's cool too that it's like, again, back to this people that talk about the nature nurture questions, like it's either nature or nurture, but it's like all these things really show that it's both, both and
Yeah.
and yeah, and something else you mentioned that I just really popped out at me, though it was just so cool, was that the songbirds will they differentiate when they're practicing and performing. So there's like different you know active brain areas in each. I don't know if that was how they deciphered it. Was it brain areas that they're looking at, or I don't know. There's just some way that they showed that the birds were processing the context of performance versus practice. And yeah, so yeah, as a musician, I think any musician will tell you it's like way different when you're practicing something, and then when you go, even when you put a camera on to like try and play it to tape it, it's like there's this extra. It's totally different. There's this extra pressure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Every speech pathologist knows that language disorders of many kinds are more prevalent in males.
That's right.
And and again, the idea of speech pathology is that there's something wrong with the production, but in fact, the perception of sound is absolutely key to the production of sound. And so these things are incredibly linked in ways that our professions don't recognize especially well. But I think that we can see, certainly through the work we and others have done, that there really are biological sex differences that can account for why female may be more resilient to language disorders and language disruption than males.
Oh, so interesting. Yeah, and does that sound perception, like auditory processing abilities have, I mean, it seems like you're sort of implying that they have something to do with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are male and female signatures, and what we see, um, actually, the female brain is more like the musician brain in that the harmonic aspects are especially enhanced in the processing of females.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so,
So
you
do you
know,
see the heightened effect for like male musicians and female musicians? Like,
well, you see them, all the time,
mm,
whether you're a musician or not. And yes, so, even within a musician group, you're going to have differences in males and females.
mm, oh, interesting. Very cool. Well, wow, I think we're just about at time now, and I feel like just flew by. It's always such a joy to speak with you and hear your expertise on the matter. So
Well,
thank
so
you.
this was fun. So I think we have really one more session, right?
Let's see. There's two. I think there's one more on the chapters and maybe like a wrap up, unless you want
Okay,
to finish
so
everything
let
up next week.
well, we can talk about that.
Perfect.